the October surprise, the OPEC Plus meeting last week, which by the end of the day, when it actually happened, it wasn't a surprise because we had very strong signals in the days before, but nonetheless, it was perhaps still a shock. Let's welcome our two formidable commentators, Mike Muller and Christoph Ruhl, to review the week past. Mike, let's kick off with you, head of Vitol in Asia. Of course, from the market's perspective, there was many reasons given by OPEC Plus and the Saudi energy minister and others who commentated around the OPEC meeting as to why they made this decision. But why, from their perspective, is one thing. How does the market? What is your perspective as to the why that they took this action, and what that matters? I think from a market point of view to interpret the why, because a lot of the analysis was it political, was it economic? What's your take as the why they did it?
Yes, I think the key takeaway from their comments, and OPEC Secretary General Haytham Al-Qais said this quite clearly, was that they felt that their own demand projections were at the high end of the spectrum, and they revised those down in light of the recessionary outlook and continued demand disappointing out of China, and felt that it was necessary to take this amount of oil off the market, despite it being the period of the year which has the highest demand typically certainly in Asia. Of course, I mean, just for the sake of completeness here, the headline number, 2 million barrels a day, is a quota number. So that's a quota cut, not an actual production cut. The OPEC narrative was that this would result in about 1 million barrels a day of actual supply being taken from the market from the month of November. But as ever with these large changes, they implement them in a month that has already finished trading east of Suez, not yet west of Suez, of course. And therefore, there is clearly some tightening at the front of the market whenever they do something like this. And if the consensus of analysts is to be believed, most people saw this as higher than expected, an action. That said, the price went up about $4, $3.50 after the announcement at the end of the week. But the market had already gone up by at least that much in anticipation of the meeting, because there was a lot of signaling, a lot of messaging that the cut was initially felt to be 500,000, maybe 1 million barrels a day. And then suddenly this 2 million barrel a day idea came out midweek, well ahead of the meeting. So OPEC's main underlying rationale for this is that they wish to continue to provide price stability and eliminate volatility in order to allow the upstream sector of the oil market to make the investments necessary to cater for future demand growth. And they therefore feel that this is something that keeps the price where it is, doesn't push the price up. Of course, the way it was received very much by the Western media was that it was a political affront to the West that is already heavily challenged on energy costs and the cost of living crisis. And the fact that it sent the market close to $100 on Brent, $98 something, was seen as very much flying in the face of the not too long ago visit by Joe Biden, where there was a very clear request to various, to the Saudi administration that they should help keep prices down in order to help control the concerns that the Western politicians had about the economy. And this was a few months back. So that was the main takeaway that you see in the media now. Right, America unhappy.
Let's welcome Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christoph, the narratives of the why, welcome your insights on, but I would also point out that since the Prince Abdulaziz, the Saudi oil minister, started signaling this intent at the end of August, when Brent had dropped to $82, $83. We're now closed out last week at $97, $98. And it's kind of framed in this US versus Saudi thing. But of course, those that are going to suffer the most from this economic pain are not the Americans or the Europeans. It's going to be all the Indians and the Asians who are currencies are weak, and now the dollar's back at $100. Your thoughts on the decision?
The dollar is back at the Brent. Okay. No, I think that was a very political decision. And I think it was a very wrong decision. It was a very regrettable decision. So for once, I side with some of the media Mike is quoting. There is, from the economic point of view, if you're worried about a recession, nothing better than to hasten the onset of the recession than back getting the oil price up by 10% is what this has done so far. In this environment where inflation sort of just seems to be coming to at least a steady rate of incline, that has jacked up energy prices and therefore the inflation rate again. And when I just don't think, you can in this situation with this kind of history sit there next to the Russian energy minister, who by the way is a friend of mine, so there's no animosity here, and say, where is the belligerence, and claim that this is a completely neutral act, when in fact the rationale for it is to keep Russia in the fold. That's an economic rationale. To bring the wedge up as much as possible between what will be the market price and what will be the price cap if it ever comes from the G7 and the US. That's also an economic rationale, but all the rest of it just points at a desire to get higher prices. And then you roll out a piece of paper and you say, oh, the prices for coal and for gas and for everything else have gone up X%, but for oil it hasn't. What are you saying there? That you also need to add, another straw on the camel's back? I think it's a very clear signal that the leadership of OPEC has, in this case, in a situation of economic warfare, sided with one side in this conflict. And I think it's the wrong side of history. And I think sooner or later, that kind of behavior will backfire.
Mike, looking at the sort of market piece of this, the removal of volatility, the removal and ultimately the hope of the return of liquidity to the market, obviously volatility works in both directions, the drop rapidly and now the rise rapidly. Your thoughts on what impact this will have on those two things, i.e. volatility and attracting back liquidity to the market? You're on mute, Mike, sorry.
My apologies. I think, to be fair on OPEC, there had been a decided switch of the expert opinion out there, most consulting shops and advisory banks, to the bearish end of the spectrum. And in terms of timing, that would have influenced OPEC quite a lot. So I do believe that they wish to keep markets stable. And the real issue, I guess, is that most people try and find the price that they're wishing to defend, whereas they say that there's no such thing as a defensive price. They just wish to keep things stable. But by all accounts, it looks like 90 was the level that was defended thus far. But yes, the clouds have started gathering in terms of concerns over oil demand disappointing. Numerous revisions down of Chinese year-on-year growth and therefore global year-on-year demand growth. I saw something in one of your pre-reads on your bullets that you put out ahead of this meeting that year-on-year demand growth is only 300,000 barrels a day. I find that a bit hard to understand, but certainly our revisions for 23 versus 22, which tend to move with the consensus out there, have moved from year-on-year 1.8 million barrels a day, 1.9 down to 1.4, now probably more like around the 1 million barrels a day. And that is the first time that we take oil demand to above the 2019 peak. Until that point happens, those who say 2019 was the peak still have the bragging rights, if you like. But yes, I think there is a risk that we over-politicize this. I'm not sure, Christoph, that OPEC had any intention of saying we're on the side of Russia. Of course, Russia are very much part of OPEC+. I think they're more concerned with balancing their budgets and, most importantly, managing the big challenge for 2023, which is certainly in Asia a big deal over the coming weeks, which is to sort out how much term oil they'll be placing to their refining customers for 2023, because that oil starts pricing in many cases from November the 1st. So they have 3.5 weeks or so to put those contracts to bed. And as you can imagine, some Asian economies have been tempted to take oil that is sanctioned elsewhere in the world. There is a clear and understandable desire to shore up the risk of some of that term volume being left uncommitted.
No, I think, let me say one thing. I'm not arguing about what we believe here. The worst thing you can do in the face of a recession, and OPEC knows that just as well as you do, is to increase oil prices to that extent in that situation, where the onset of the recession clearly is already accelerated by other high energy prices. Everybody knows that. So this will only result in a hastening of the decline in demand, and then a further question about further cuts or in some sort of capitulation. It will make life, the economic life for all of us, much more ugly. And I think there should not be any doubt about that.
And in particular, Christoph, my earlier point, to Asia, to those less well-off countries that are suffering with dealing with a very strong dollar and at least there was some relief from a lower energy price, but now you've got the bionic dollar and $100 oil. And
that's not all. That's not all, because now we get into this. So historically, they have not done this kind of thing. That's also a big watershed here. And when a recession was looming, they were sort of more careful for good reasons. But there's also something else coming, which is this kind of American-induced price cap, And now you have a market. Supply is constrained, prices are constrained. A dual price system is going to be a royal mess. And those who will suffer the most, you're right, are those who have the double whammy from the high dollar. And of course, with inflation going up, the Fed will continue to act. The dollar will be even stronger. So this has accelerated all the bad moves in the global economy in one fell swoop.
Sean,
I think sorry, go ahead.
If I can just butt in, sorry, if you keep that question. I think OPEC are very much convinced that there was a real concern at the lower deployment of rigs in the US in response to WTI dipping into the high 70s. Because with the cost escalation in the US, there was real evidence of rigs being deployed less, with conservative attitudes being taken because of the high cost and the very low unemployment in the USA. And as a consequence, I think their overarching theme, I'll repeat it, is the underinvestment theme, where they are concerned that things will be much worse for the oil balance than they are today. Obviously, recession and other commodities to one side. For the oil balance, if there is no stability in prices at a high enough level to get the oil majors and others to invest in upstream developments, exploration programs, near field development, and all that sort of stuff, which has been woefully lacking in recent years.
So they did this because they're worried about the oil producers in the US, and then, come on.
No, they're worried. I think there is a concern that there won't be enough investment, and therefore spare capacity will be a challenge, because even Saudi themselves proclaimed that their steady state maximum is 12 a day. That was a very interesting comment that came out at the Energy Institute conference just before your conference last week, Sean.
As you said, we're not even back at 2019 levels yet. So
there's no way avoiding the optics. The optics are one thing, and then perhaps all the reasons are another. But one thing I did notice in the optics was that Novak did not sit at the press conference table after the meeting in a way that he would have always done in previous OPEC plus press conferences. So clearly there was some awareness of what that might look like. But Mike, I wanted to ask you on the point, I'm just getting back to the volatility and the liquidity issue. And there obviously is the CapEx issue you just referenced. But last week you said about volatility that one way of dealing with that was to have the monthly meetings and OPEC plus tweaking the market as needed, as they've done in recent years. And now in the sub-headlines of this agreement just last week with OPEC plus, there was two things that really didn't get reported on. One was that they moved their meetings from monthly to 2 monthly. So they're only meeting every 2 months. And secondly, the ministerial part of that meeting, OPEC plus, was to every 6 months. So the JMMC moved every 2 months, the minister moved every 6 months. And the other part of the agreement that was announced was that this agreement last week was to extend it to the end of 2023, because OPEC plus agreement was due to expire at the end of 2022. So those other pieces were buried in the press release. I just wanted to get, Mike, your thoughts on, do they matter? Do they help or not help with liquidity and volatility?
That's very good of you to highlight this, Sean. And there was one more indeed that I think they gave until March 2023 to those who had continued to overproduce. Not that there are many of those in recent months, to come back in line and leave oil off the market. Yes, it is a bit odd, I guess, because this was their first face-to-face meeting, where indeed they had the lineup at the end. So I think they can change their minds on these things. If it's warranted, they will convene in greater numbers. I wouldn't read too much into the fact that they only choose to convene every 2 months and in a ministerial forum every 6 months. But I guess that's roughly where they used to be. It was quarterly, wasn't it, before COVID? So your question on what this means for volatility, I mean, it is an awkward one. I think the point that you and Christoph were making on demand destruction is a very real one, not just because the strong dollar is weighing more heavily on those economies that can't afford the energy cost, but also you've seen fewer subsidies in place in many economies. Here in Asia, Indonesia, for example, lifted the minimum price for gasoline by about 25-30%, and there's very clear early evidence of that, meaning people are consuming less, they're driving around less, and that's just one of many such examples. Yes, people are seeing last week as a volatile move, but I still see people talking about concerns over next year's year-on-year demand growth. And there is a significant slug of non-OPEC production coming into the market. We have to remind ourselves, those provinces in northern Latin America, Brazil, there is some investment translating through to extra production there. And overall, people don't have aggressive draws in their forward balances, even after this OPEC plus announcement. So I don't think the market's been panicked. And despite the fact that if you do a sweep of all the analysis and consulting shops straight after OPEC, they're all calling for $100 plus oil now, which was quite remarkable. I don't think deep down too many traders believe the market's going straight to 100 plus.
Christoph, just picking up on the other aspects of last week, which are sort of coexisting with this decision. I mean, on the pure sort of more commercial face of this, OPEC plus, and particularly Saudi and others, want a higher oil price. Clearly, they've got budgets, they've got big projects, they need the revenue. The question is, can they stop the oil price correction that was clearly underway? We now have the decision on Friday, or not the decision, the data point on Friday of US jobs report, which were again better than expected. Equity markets tanked with the outlook of much more robust for longer interest rates. What if you just speak at the intersection of all those points?
Two things, John. So first of all, importantly, I usually do that, but I didn't say they did it for the money. I said it was a political decision, and as such, very regrettable. They had reasons to complain about, the SPR release. That must be something irking them. The price cap coming must be something irking them. The need to keep, and so on. And the problem is that it's bad enough to have a producer association distorting markets. So I'm a market fan, as you can tell. But it's worse if it starts doing this for political reasons. That's how OPEC was founded. That's where it returned to now, and this is not a good sign. And secondly, I think you're right. We are living in a world which is not simple anymore. So we have this relatively calm surface, but there's a multiple number of crises everywhere, whirling just under the surface. There is China and the economy of it. There is the inflation problem globally. There is not only Russia, but also Iran. There is, the political election. There's the standoff in Europe on the energy front. And so it feels like many of these crises at the same time. Somebody has coined this term polycrisis. That's the kind of world we used to have. First COVID and then a war, and one after another, and we complained about it. Now we have them all in parallel. And what this OPEC decision does, many of these whirlwinds under the surface, it accelerates them in the wrong direction. It will accelerate inflation and therefore a stronger dollar. It will accelerate energy wars, the high energy costs, and therefore the recession danger in Asia and in Europe, and so on and so forth, and all the way down to the sort of political military conflict. I'm interested to see how these countries vote at the General Assembly next week when it comes to. We're after all in a situation where one country attacked another country, and I thought we're all sitting in a boat of saying this is not acceptable and has to stop. And in so many ways now, this gets deeper. And just one last thought, even the conflict gets deeper. We've seen what happened on the bridge of the Crimea. I mean, some of us may have liked this very much. This is not the issue. It's a conflict that reaches more and more into very destructive behind the frontline infrastructure attacks. Most of you will not be aware, but it was in the news briefly yesterday, that yesterday all German railway traffic in northern Germany was out, and it was for sabotage. They now keep this under wraps, but it was a very clear story. There was an interference in northern Germany where you had to go down a shaft, remove a big concrete slab and cut one particular cable, and then do the same thing hundreds of kilometers away in Berlin, go down there in a big shaft full of electronics, cut another particular cable. And in this way, you could eliminate the digital communication system of the railways. And so they were out for 3 hours, all of them, the regional ones, the freight ones, the personal ones, the interregional ones, the international ones, no traffic to Berlin. And the North Sea 2 pipeline. So I think wherever you look, it's getting a bit sort of more to the edge. And this action, again, fits that pattern. And what we need is just the opposite. We need some sort of sense coming in there.
Mike, the other story that we had on the digest last week and that has come up in this equation is the SPR, that clearly the US, or the potential reaction of the US. Biden took a lot of assaults at the end of last week. What are you going to do about this sort of challenge by OPEC Plus? And well, we're looking at the options, a greater release from SPR being one of them. But ultimately, there's the other reality that the White House and the US has to refill that SPR, which in itself creates its own demand. Where do you see the impact of that vis-a-vis, again, volatility and market requirement, that the cutting from OPEC Plus creates a tighter market? SPR release eases that. Your thoughts on that SPR piece, the emptying it and then the refilling of it?
Yes, I'll start by stating the obvious, which is if you have less SPR, that's less supply cushion, that's less security of supply, and therefore that's more volatility inducing. It is a concern if spare capacity is concentrated in the hands of a couple of OPEC producers, or maybe 3 of them. But yeah, we were getting mixed messages. There was a disbelief when the initial plan came out several months back at the rate at which they were able to release. And now we've seen it. There were some weeks when the release was at 800,000 barrels a day or so, which is more than people thought possible. And now the recent talk that you highlighted of the desire to refill it, obviously the Biden administration doesn't really want to be saying that at a time that they're concerned about oil prices going up, and therefore they might be advised to put some targets on it in terms of price. But I think we have to go back to the bigger picture, which is what is SPR there for? For those who believe that in the longer run, the energy dependency in the Western Hemisphere is going to reduce, you may never need to go back to quite the same maximum level that the SPR was at if the energy transition starts to take effect, which of course is also helped by high oil prices. So the extent of investment in new energies that the Biden administration seems intent on accelerating, and Europe is already well ahead of the world on, would arguably do away with the need to entirely replace the SPR. But I think it remains to be seen in the playbook of late 22 and the rest of 23 whether oil price is sufficiently volatile and concerning to compel governments to put that oil back. Because yes, a lot has been taken out, and therefore yes, less SPR, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, is something that causes more volatility.
What about, Mike, just to follow up on that vis-a-vis China, because that was the other announcement last week, was the Chinese facilitating a massive increase in export quotas of products from China out of China in the fourth quarter. The impact of that, obviously more supply, bearish for middle distillates?
Yes, it clearly did impact the distillate market a lot in the periods during the APEC conference 2 weeks back or week and a half back. And again, there was the similar sort of disbelief at the rate at which China was looking to export, because the mandated figure was a 15 million ton export program, which was going to kick in the middle of October, because the first half of October had already traded and it wasn't really possible to get ships anymore. Most people still believe that's too much to do. And of course, it's actually 13 million tons of clean products and nearly 2 million tons of residue of fuel oil. Nonetheless, it does look like that's the mandate. And the only way that can happen is, number one, refineries run more crude in China, which they've been abstaining from doing. And number two, they draw on inventories. Now, fortunately, China is in a position to do both because they have high inventories. You've seen a massive shift in global inventories from the rest of the world to China over the course of this year. And if it actually happens, it will certainly give China more flattering trade balance because they're net exporting products by the end of the calendar year. But it will take away the one strategic inventory that is still at the high, if you like. And therefore, China joins the US and Europe in depleting its SPR, leaving, as I said before, the only buffer for supply to come from in OPEC. And of course, that buffer will not be needed if things stay normal, because we're concerned about demand in China and generally recessionary concerns. But if there were to be a disruption in a large producing province somewhere in the world because of some geopolitical event, that could be of concern.
Let's get the survey question. And again, it sort of addresses this why piece. There are many reasons given by OPEC Plus for 2 million barrel a day cut, quota cut, but what does the market think the biggest reason is? OPEC wants $90 floor on Brent. OPEC wants to remove volatility and improve liquidity. OPEC wants to damage Biden in midterm elections. For all of the above. Christoph, we are now close to mid-October, the beginning of moving from autumn into winter in Europe. There's sort of growing reports about how damaged German industry will be. Looking at where the European energy crisis is now mid-October, and particularly as it impacts German industry, the biggest and most important economic heart of Europe. How is that looking? What's your outlook for that?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult winter, and a lot will ride on the sort of willingness of the population to stomach some real cuts, if you want, at least to lower the temperature. On oil, let me just also answer the question you asked earlier. So you said rightly, we were on a downward trend, and around that was a lot of volatility. I, for one, don't think that has changed. So I think despite this cut, we will see a downward trend from a higher level now. So we have moved the whole thing up, and volatility. And the situation is exactly unchanged in what Mike has said. The safety margins, excess capacity inventories are so thin that any kind of big geopolitical event may lead to price spikes, and that's the danger. It's different in natural gas and coal and electricity production in Europe. If the winter is mild, there will be no problem. If it's standard, it will be a bit of a problem. And if it is cold, there will be a big problem. It seems to be very clear now that Russia will not support Europe in this, but they have one target and one target only, which is to create demonstrations and social discontent and political pressure towards not delivering more weapons to the Ukraine. It is also clear that in the field of power generation, probably Europe is fine. Certainly Germany is fine because you have this enormous degree of substitutability. So when you look at three things you can do with natural gas, so one, power is a little problem. Two, industrial feedstock. That is a problem because it has been substituted to the extent possible. So what is left now in natural gas used for industrial feedstock is what cannot be substituted. And the chemical industry is Germany's third biggest industry, so they cannot afford to not use natural gas for that. And that means that the brunt of the burden of eventual cuts will be on the third element, which is space heating, which is the heating of houses and apartments of the population. And we had this discussion here often, the Black Forest, how they accumulate wood and how in Germany you can't get an electric heater anymore, which is all true. But I think that so far, opinion polls are the only thing we have to go by, and opinion polls clearly indicate that people are willing to take hardship for that winter in order to not go back and give in to this kind of energy blackmail. And my best guess is that it will remain like that. The damage to the industry will then be limited. You see, in Europe and in Germany, you have the legal situation clearly saying the population needs to be protected, space heating needs to be protected, and everything else needs to be cut first. The reality, which everybody knows, is industry has to be protected first because you don't want to slide into a major recession for either Germany or, by implication, Europe. And I think people understand that and are willing to go the extra mile. The Germans have changed the silly idea of taxing natural gas to support industry, done away with that. Europe seems to likely to introduce a gas price cap and an oil price cap on top of it, which is going to be phenomenally expensive. And I don't know how sensible, depends on the level. But overall, I think it is more likely than not that the winter will pass and Russia will have lost its gas market, and it will take them 10 years to build a pipeline to Asia to make good for it. Everybody has lost, but Russia has lost the most.
Let's get the survey question result. Obviously, we're going to put this on the social media for voting today. Overwhelmingly, I'm thinking of the oil price there, the target. Mike, I wanted to give you the last word today just to touch on the week ahead, which of course includes the upcoming Chinese Party Congress that's been waiting all year for. that's a pretty predetermined performance piece, and the coronation of President Xi is expected. But my question to you is, what do you expect after that is over? Where will China go from the sort of point from after the Congress, and then obviously towards the Chinese New Year at the end of January, which is typically quite a big demand period for oil in China?
Yes, Sean, so you said it's exactly this time next week, 16th of October, the Congress will take place where Paramount Leader will be given his extension. There has been a lot of debate on this, even though China's been largely on leave due to their Golden Week last week. But in the week before that, during APEC, there were a few Chinese delegations that braved the quarantine restrictions and came over. And they were all of the view that the easing of COVID restrictive measures will be gradual. There is a widespread concern and even a fear in the population of this thing running out of control and what it can do. And therefore, I don't think we're going to see the Chinese tourists in the skies and the Chinese business people on airplanes coming to conferences overseas, anything like in Q4. The other concern, of course, in China is that the economic data is not great. Part of this mandatory export of petroleum products seems to be part of wanting to improve those trade statistics. But what really bothers me is that the continued industrial output data, productivity data in China is disappointing. Those German chemical plants that are not running, or those German gas-intensive heavy industries, you would assume the global economy would need factories elsewhere to make up for any shortfalls that are not being made in the EU where the costs are too high. And it's clearly not happening in China, which is where it should be happening. So that tells you that Chinese demand is really down, and petrochemicals in particular. So I think China's going to take quite some time to deleverage its property problem, the Evergrande issue and all that. And I don't think we're going to see any snap in Chinese demand. There may be some headlines coming out next Sunday, which give the market the reason to buy the market. But I don't see any huge fundamental changes, certainly not affecting oil demand.
What do you hear about a stimulus?
A stimulus out of China.
Yeah, more important than the COVID restrictions, is there going to be an economic stimulus in the cards after the Congress?
I think we can assume there will be plenty of that, but there's already been a fair bit of it, right, to prop up infrastructure outlay and to help the ailing property construction sector, which, I mean, cement is one of the biggest consumers of power in China. And there've obviously also been a huge stimulus to the coal industry, where coal-fired capacity and coal mining has gone up astonishingly to do away with the need for China to add fuel to the LNG fire. So there's been a fair bit of government guidance and urging, and I think a lot of that is probably quite easily portrayed as subsidies, Christoph. Yeah.
We'll wrap it up there. It certainly will be interesting to see where a direction of travel goes in the week ahead. I would have shared Christoph's view, and I think, Mike, you were sharing it as well, that this downward trend in oil prices would resume after the bombing of the Crimea Bridge. The escalation in the conflict there, where you could see some civilian infrastructure, the Russians' retaliation there, that could maybe act as a geopolitical prop to push that price above 100 before that downward draft returns. But from most people I'm talking to in the Gulf region in recent weeks, there's very I've struggled to find any appetite anywhere of people who want to cut their production. Whatever they're saying in public, the actual cutting of oil production is hard to find, the appetite for it. Everything is indicating the opposite direction, is the ramping up of certainly production capacity, maybe not execution. But we'll have to wait and see. Mike Muller, head of Vitol Asia, awesome to have you back at the table. Christoph Ruhl, glad you're looking so well, having come through your little COVID window. Hope you're feeling better. We'll catch up with everybody this week, 10:30 UAE time.